The morning of March 7th, 1943 began for Erwin Rommel the way the past 4 months had been ending, with a report he did not want to read. He was at Sfax on the Tunisian coast, in a commandeered villa that smelled of mildew and the salt air coming in off the Mediterranean. His body was failing him. The jaundice had turned the whites of his eyes a dull yellow. The desert had done something to his blood pressure that the doctors in Berlin were still trying to understand. He was 51 years old, and he looked 10 years beyond it. His intelligence officer set a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of him. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The report was not about the previous day. He already knew about the previous day. 52 German tanks lost in a single morning at Medellin, attacking a British position that had been waiting for them, guns pre-sighted, every approach covered, Montgomery's artillery positioned, as if someone had told him in advance exactly where the panzers would come and when. Which, through channels that would not be publicly understood until years after the war, is precisely what had happened. Rommel had sent his armor into a trap he could not see, and the trap had closed, and the morning of March 7th there was nothing left to say about it. The report was about the Americans. Specifically, it confirmed a change of command in the American sector. General Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the United States Second Corps through the worst weeks of the Tunisian campaign, had been relieved. The officer replacing him had arrived at Jebel Kouif the previous afternoon. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General. 3 stars. Rommel looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he set it down. Then he picked it up again. What happened in that villa over the following 2 days is not entirely a matter of record. Rommel was a private man in the ways that mattered, and the communications from that period are fragmented. But the record that does exist, assembled from his private papers, the post-war accounts of his staff, and the testimony of officers on both sides of the line, tells a story more complicated than the myths that have grown up around it. It tells the story of 2 professional soldiers who had spent years studying each other from across an ocean, who found themselves finally close enough to fight, and who never did. It tells the story of what happens to an army when the right man arrives at the exact moment that army needs him most, and what happens to the enemy army when it has to discover, without warning, what that man has built. And it tells the story of what Erwin Rommel actually wrote and said about the Americans he had broken at Kasserine Pass, and what he came to understand about what they would become. To understand what that intelligence report meant, you have to understand what Kasserine had been. The battle was fought across the central mountain range of Tunisia between the 14th and 23rd of February, 1943. The Kasserine Pass itself was a gap in the western dorsale, the spine of mountains that divided coastal Tunisia from the high desert plateau behind it. The ground there was brutal in the particular way that North African terrain was brutal, open enough to invite armor forward, broken enough to ambush it, with the rocky ridgelines holding command over every road below. The Americans holding those roads in February of 1943 were not ready for what came at them. That is not a simple statement, and it carries no contempt for the individual soldiers who died there. The United States Army in 1943 was an institution that had been a mobilizing force for barely 14 months. It had gone from a peacetime establishment of fewer than 200,000 men to an army of millions, building its doctrine and its command culture as it expanded, drawing officers from civilian life and training them at speeds that would have been considered reckless in any previous generation. The officers leading those men at Kasserine had spent their careers in a peacetime army that had not fought a sustained engagement in more than 20 years. They had studied war. They had trained for it. They had not yet been tested by a professional enemy, with 2 years of desert combat behind it. Rommel gave them that test on a February morning in the dark. The attack began before dawn on the 14th. 3 German armored columns moved through the Fade Pass and drove into the American positions with a coordination that had made the Afrika Korps famous since its first campaigns against the British in 1941. The principle was not complicated. Armor and artillery and motorized infantry working as a single weapon, each element covering the others. Decisions made at the front by commanders who could see the ground, adjustments executed faster than the opposing headquarters could respond to what was already happening. The Americans moved to meet it the way they had been trained to meet it, committing armor in separate formations to separate points of contact, each unit outnumbered in its individual fight, none of them able to concentrate before the German columns had already broken through and turned. The first American armored unit to engage lost 62 tanks in a single afternoon. The survivors pulled back. The replacements moved up and met the same conditions and took the same losses. By the evening of the 16th, the Fade Pass had fallen completely, and the German columns were driving west through terrain that had been behind the American front line 48 hours earlier. 4 American infantry battalions were encircled. A combat command of the 1st Armored Division was destroyed fighting in the rough country around Sidi Bouzid. Men came back out of those engagements on foot, some of them without their rifles. Kasserine itself fell on the 19th of February. In the days that followed, Rommel's columns pushed roughly 50 miles through the Allied position, threatening supply bases and airfields that the entire bridgehead depended on, reaching depths that had not been seen on the Western Front since the fall of France. He was eventually stopped. British reserves moved south to plug the breakthrough. His supply lines, always the operational weakness in North Africa, stretched past the point where he could maintain momentum. On the 22nd of February, his forward columns ran into a prepared British defense at Thala and were turned back. He pulled back through the pass he had taken 3 days earlier. The American losses from Kasserine were not published in full at the time, and the army had its reasons for that discretion. Roughly 6,000 casualties in 10 days. More than 200 tanks lost. The airfield at Thalepte had to be abandoned so quickly that aircraft were destroyed on the runway to prevent their capture. General Fredendall commanded from a headquarters 40 miles behind the line. In a bunker his engineers had spent 3 weeks digging into a hillside, and the orders that came out of that bunker were confused in ways that the units trying to follow them could not always reconcile with what they were actually facing. Rommel's assessment of American forces after Kasserine was, by the evidence of his private papers, one of qualified contempt. Qualified because he was too careful a soldier to mistake poor leadership for poor soldiers. In notes recorded in the period after the battle, and preserved in the compilation later edited by the British military historian Basil Adelhard, Rommel wrote that American equipment was genuinely impressive, and their logistics were functioning at a level his own army had never been able to match. He noted that American soldiers, taken as individuals, had shown genuine courage and would become formidable fighters given proper training and time. Given proper training, given time, those qualifications carried an assumption that the Americans did not yet have the right man to provide either one. The problem at Kasserine had not been the soldiers in the foxholes. It had been the headquarters making decisions about where those foxholes were dug and when the men in them were permitted to withdraw. The command culture of Second Corps, as Rommel read it from the available evidence, was everything he expected from an army that had not yet been forced to confront the consequences of getting it wrong. He did not believe that changing the name on the headquarters door would change the culture behind it. Armies did not transform in days. The habits of a command structure, the reflexes of its staff officers under fire, the instincts that told a regimental commander whether to hold or pull back, these things were built across months of shared experience and the slow pressure of repeated consequence. He was right about all of that. He was wrong about the man. George Patton arrived at Jebel Kouif on the afternoon of March 6, 1943. He came by aircraft and then by jeep, and the first thing the officers of Second Corps noticed about him was that he was wearing his best uniform. Not field dress, not the practical khakis that most officers in Tunisia had settled into. His helmet was polished. His cavalry boots caught the light. He carried a riding crop. He did not look like a man who had come to assess the situation. He looked like a man who had already reached his conclusions and had arrived to act on them. Within 24 hours, he had issued orders that moved through the Corps like weather. They were not orders about tactics or positions or the enemy. They were orders about neckties, about helmet straps, about the physical bearing of every man in the command. Officers who appeared before their superiors without proper uniform and kit were fined on the spot. Officers who passed their own men in vehicles without requiring military courtesy were relieved. Patton drove through the Corps area personally during those first 72 hours, stopping every vehicle and every patrol he encountered, inspecting them the way a man inspects something he is responsible for and intends to be responsible for. The reaction among his men covered the available spectrum from fury to bewilderment. The connection between a properly fastened helmet and the ability to stop a German armored column was not immediately evident to a private who had been living in a slit trench since Kasserine. Patton understood this. He was not a theatrical man in the sense of being an empty one. He had been studying war since West Point, and then for 3 more decades after it, cavalry doctrine, tank doctrine, the campaigns of Frederick the Great, the memoirs of commanders from a dozen armies in a dozen wars. He had read the intelligence reports coming out of the North Africa campaign since Rommel's first appearance in Libya in 1941. He had studied the way Rommel moved, from the front, fast, making decisions at the point of contact rather than from behind it, trusting his subordinate commanders to execute what he could not supervise directly. He had also read Rommel's published book, the Infantry Tactics Manual that had come out of Germany in 1937, based on Rommel's own experience commanding a mountain battalion in the First War. It was a precise, demanding book, written by a man who believed that the physical courage to be at the front and the intellectual discipline to understand what was happening there were not separate qualities, but the same quality expressed in different registers. Patton had underlined it. He had made notes in the margins. He did not agree with everything in it, but he respected the mind behind it, and he had found nothing in the 2 years of North Africa fighting to diminish that respect. The necktie order was not about neckties. It was about the single premise that governed everything Patton understood about military effectiveness, that an army which cannot maintain discipline in a rear area cannot maintain under fire, that the habits which keep soldiers alive under the worst pressure are exactly the habits that look unnecessary in the absence of that pressure. That if the men in a headquarters cannot be trusted to wear their kit correctly in camp, the officer responsible for that headquarters cannot trust them to function correctly when the shells arrive. He was not rebuilding the army by explaining this. He was rebuilding it by demanding it, day after day, in front of witnesses at personal cost to anyone who failed to meet the standard. German intelligence tracked the change in the American sector with the same methodical attention it gave every development along the front. Signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, the interrogation of prisoners captured in patrol contacts, all of it fed into the daily intelligence picture that crossed the desk of the German command in Tunisia. The name Patton appeared in those intercepts. He was not unknown. His performance commanding the Western Task Force during the American landings in Morocco the previous November had been noted, and the assessment had been that he was aggressive, possibly reckless, an officer who valued speed over caution. That assessment was not wrong. It was simply incomplete in the ways that mattered. What German intelligence could not yet see in the first 2 weeks of March was what was happening inside the Corps. The daily inspections, the forced marches Patton ordered for units that had been sitting static since Kasserine. The relief of officers who had, in Patton's judgment, lost the physical willingness to be where their men were. The regimental commanders he required to sleep in the positions their men occupied, rather than in rear billets. The field hospitals he visited in his polished boots, walking through the wards and speaking with the wounded men who had come back through the pass. He was reading his army the way a surgeon reads a patient, looking for what it could actually do beneath the damage it had taken, and then working from what he found. He was not managing morale. He was building a command culture, and he was building it at a speed that should not have been possible, except that the men of Second Corps had already been through the thing that shows a soldier what he is actually made of, and some of them had discovered in the process that they were made of more than Kasserine had suggested. 3 days after Patton arrived, Rommel left. The departure was framed as a medical leave, and the medical facts were genuine. The jaundice was real. The blood pressure readings his physician had been quietly forwarding to Germany for 2 months were real. The exhaustion was something that showed in his face to every officer who saw him in those last days at Sfax. A man who had pushed his body past what a body will sustain for extended periods and was now discovering the specific cost of that. But there was a strategic dimension to it as well. and Rommel was honest about it in his private correspondence in ways he could not be in official communications. He had flown to Hitler's headquarters weeks earlier and told the Führer directly that North Africa was not recoverable, that the Allied air superiority over the Mediterranean was already strangling German supply, that the mathematics of the reinforcement race had moved past the point where German logistics could compete, that the army in Tunisia should be evacuated while there was still time to save the men for the battles that would matter on the continent. Hitler had answered this with a particular controlled fury that ended conversations at his headquarters. Rommel was ordered back to Africa. He went back. He launched the assault at Medellin. The assault failed in a way that was almost worse than a narrow defeat, because it failed completely without achieving anything that could be pointed to as having been worth the cost. 52 tanks in a single morning. And then on the 9th of March, 1943, Erwin Rommel boarded an aircraft and left the African continent. He would not return. Command passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, a methodical officer who had none of Rommel's gift for improvisation and was inheriting a strategic situation that was already beyond what improvisation could solve. Von Arnim received the problem. He also received, in the intelligence summaries crossing his desk in the second week of March, the assessments of what was happening in the American sector. Those assessments were careful in the measured way of German military intelligence. They did not predict what was coming. They did not fully account for what 10 days under a new commander had produced in the formations that had broken at Kasserine. But they noted, without drama, that the change of command in the American sector appeared to represent a genuine shift. The previous static quality of Second Corps had given way to movement. Patrol activity was increasing. Units that had been dispersed and partially disorganized were being consolidated. The Corps was, in the language the summary used, showing signs of returning effectiveness. Von Arnim read the assessments. He filed them. And on the 22nd of March, 1943, he sent the 10th Panzer Division forward to test what the Americans had built in the El Getter Valley south of Gafsa. The 10th Panzer was not a formation von Arnim had chosen carelessly. It was one of the most experienced armored divisions in the German army. It had fought in France in 1940. It had fought on the Eastern Front. It had been reconstituted after severe losses and brought back to full strength. And it came into the El Getter sector with close to 100 tanks and the accumulated experience of 3 years of modern armored warfare against opponents who had included some of the best soldiers in the world. What it had not done was fight in American formation under George Patton. Patton had been on the ground at El Getter personally for 2 days before the German attack. He was not a man who prepared positions by map. He had walked the defile on foot, looked at the hills rising on both sides of the road, stood at the points where an attacking armor column would be forced to compress and slow, and made his dispositions based on what he had seen with his own eyes. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, held the ground. The artillery was positioned with specific reference to the ground Patton had walked. The anti-tank guns were dug in at the angles that the terrain of that particular valley made correct. On the morning of March 23rd, the 10th Panzer came forward through the dawn light in the disciplined column formation that desert armor used when moving across open ground toward a defended position. It came forward into something it had not expected to find. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. What happened in the valley at El Getter over the following 8 hours is the factual answer to the question that frames this story. Not the answer that most people expect, not the dramatic confrontation between 2 famous commanders on the same piece of ground, because that confrontation never happened. Rommel was already in Germany by March 23rd. He had been gone for 2 weeks. The man who had broken the Americans at Kasserine was not present to see what the Americans had become. But what the 10th Panzer encountered that morning, and what it reported back to von Arnim's headquarters that afternoon, and what von Arnim's headquarters reported to the Army Group Command, and what the Army Group Command relayed to Germany in the signals traffic that Allied intelligence was quietly reading through channels whose existence would not be publicly acknowledged for decades, tells the story more precisely than any invented confrontation could have. The German armored column came forward. The American artillery opened up at ranges that indicated the guns had been pre-sighted on exactly the ground the panzers were crossing. The anti-tank fire came from positions that the German forward elements had not identified during their approach. The infantry holding the ridge lines did not pull back when the pressure built, which was the behavior the 10th Panzer had been trained to expect based on what American infantry had done at Kasserine and in the engagement since. It held. It held under the specific conditions that had previously caused American formations to break, taking casualties in position, maintaining contact with adjacent units, accepting the weight of the attack without the lateral drift that opens gaps in a defensive line. By early afternoon, the 10th Panzer had been stopped, not merely slowed. Stopped. The division that had come forward with nearly 100 tanks withdrew, with roughly 30 of them destroyed on the ground behind it. The American line had not moved. It was the first time in the North Africa campaign that an American force had absorbed a full German armored assault and held its position. The after-action report that the 10th Panzer submitted to von Arnim's headquarters that evening was a document in the language of German military precision. But what it said, stripped of that language, was that the Americans they had fought that morning were not the Americans they had encountered at Kasserine. The resistance had been of a completely different character. The coordination between arms had been of a quality they had not previously seen in the American forces. The defensive positions had shown an understanding of terrain that had not been evident in earlier engagements. Whoever had reorganized and retrained this formation in the preceding weeks had done so with uncommon skill and speed. Von Arnim knew the name. Patton, the same name that had appeared in the intelligence summaries a week before the attack. The same officer whose arrival his predecessor had noted and whose army had spent 10 days being rebuilt before anyone in the German command had fully understood what that meant. What Rommel himself knew, by the time the reports from El Getter reached Germany and were compiled into the strategic assessments that crossed the desks of the senior German command, was the thing he had written in his private papers before he left, that the Americans were going to get better, that the soldiers were already capable of it, that the deficiency at Kasserine had been one of leadership, not of the men being led, and that the moment the right commander arrived and gave the American army the time and the framework it needed, it would become something different from what it had been in the passes of the Westerdorsale in February. He had written that. He had left Africa. He had not lived to see whether he was right. He was right. The German after-action report from El Getter arrived at von Arnim's headquarters on the evening of March 23, 1943. It was written in the compressed, precise language that German staff officers used when describing a tactical outcome that did not go the way the plan had intended. It stated that the 10th Panzer Division had encountered resistance of a character and quality not previously observed in the American sector, that the defensive positions had demonstrated an understanding of terrain and an integration of arms that were inconsistent with the American performance at Kasserine, that the attack had been halted with significant armored losses, that the assessment of the American Second Corps as a degraded formation requiring time and recovery before it could again present a serious operational problem required revision. Von Arnim sent that report to Army Group Africa. Army Group Africa sent its summary to Berlin. What moved through those channels over the following days was not a dramatic announcement. It was the gradual accumulation of evidence that the Americans in Tunisia had changed in ways the German command had not anticipated, at a speed that the German command had not believed possible. This revision and assessment did not come as a single moment of recognition. It came the way most important intelligence arrives, slowly, in pieces, with each new piece requiring the previous assessment to be adjusted until the adjusted assessment no longer resembled what had been there before. But by the first week of April 1943, the picture inside the German command was clear enough that the Army Group commander was reporting to the Wehrmacht High Command that the American Second Corps now constituted a genuine offensive threat, and that its improvement could be attributed in significant part to the change of command that had taken place in early March. The name in those reports was Patton's. What Patton himself was doing during those weeks was, by the standards of what came after, relatively contained. He drove the Corps forward after El Getter, pressing toward Gafsa and then east toward the coast, looking for the seam where sustained American pressure could split the German and Italian defensive lines and cut the bridgehead in two. The fighting in April 1943 was grinding in the specific way that fighting in mountain terrain is grinding. Costly for both sides, progress measured in hundreds of yards, the momentum that El Getter had generated not yet converted into the kind of decisive rupture that would end the campaign. He argued with his superiors, British and American alike, over the allocation of routes and axes of advance. He was not an easy man to work alongside, and he did not pretend to be. On April 15th, he was transferred. The transfer was not a demotion. It was Eisenhower pulling his most capable armored commander out of the line to plan the next operation. The invasion of Sicily, scheduled for the summer, which would require the kind of combined arms planning and speed of execution that Patton had just demonstrated he could achieve. Omar Bradley, who had served as Patton's deputy at Second Corps, took command of the Corps and led it through the final battles that ended the North Africa campaign. Tunis fell on May 7th. The German and Italian forces in Tunisia, roughly 250,000 men, surrendered between the 8th and 13th of May, 1943. Among those who laid down their arms on May 12th was General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim himself, captured by a British patrol in the hills north of Tunis. He was treated correctly and transported to prisoner of war facilities in Britain, where he spent the remaining years of the war. He had inherited a lost campaign. He had fought it with the resources available. He was not, by any serious assessment, responsible for the outcome. But he had commanded the forces that discovered, at El Getter and in the weeks that followed, what the Americans had become under Patton's hand, and that discovery had come too late and cost too much to change anything that mattered. The 250,000 prisoners who went into Allied captivity in Tunisia represented the second great Axis encirclement loss of the war, following Stalingrad. It was a number that matched the German and Romanian and Italian losses in the Soviet Union 4 months earlier, and its strategic meaning was similar. The Axis had committed forces it could not replace to a theater it could not hold, and the result was a catastrophic forfeiture of men and equipment at the precise moment when those men and that equipment were needed elsewhere. Rommel had seen this coming. He had said so. He had been told to hold. He spent the spring and summer of 1943 convalescing in Germany, following the North Africa campaign in the briefings that reached him through official channels and in the reports of officers who came through Berlin from the theater. What he read confirmed what he had expected. The Americans had consolidated the improvement that Patton had begun. The formations that had broken at Kasserine were the same formations that had held at El Getter, that had pushed through to the coast, that had taken their share of the 250,000 prisoners. The transformation had survived the change of command from Patton to Bradley. It had become structural rather than personal, which was the only kind of transformation that lasted. In his private papers, compiled from diary entries and letters and analytical notes written during this period and afterward, Rommel addressed what had happened in North Africa with the particular honesty of a man who no longer had a command to protect and was trying to understand for himself what the campaign had meant. The papers were edited and published after his death by the British military historian Basil Adelhard, and they remain one of the clearest primary sources on the German experience in North Africa precisely because they were written without the defensive self-justification that marks so many post-war memoirs. On the question of American forces, Rommel was direct. He had believed, coming out of Kasserine, that the Americans would not transform quickly enough to present a serious threat before the German position in Tunisia was settled by other factors. He had been wrong about the speed. The change that Patton had implemented in Second Corps between March 6th and March 23rd was, in Rommel's written assessment, not a matter of tactics or training schedules. It was a matter of command presence, the specific kind of authority that communicates to soldiers at every level of formation that the man above them understands what they are being asked to do, has been where they are, and will hold them to what they are capable of rather than to what they have already demonstrated. He wrote that the difference between the Americans he had faced at Kasserine and the Americans who held at El Getter was not a difference in the soldiers. It was a difference in what the soldiers believed about themselves. And that belief had been installed in 17 days. He did not write these things about Patton by name in every passage. The papers are not organized as a commentary on individual commanders, but the timeline is clear, and the assessment is clear, and the officers who worked with Rommel in his final years have been consistent in their accounts. He understood what had happened in the American command, he understood who had done it, and he took no pleasure in having been right about the potential and wrong about the pace. There's a version of this story that most people know, and it is false, and it is worth addressing directly because it has become so embedded in the popular understanding of these two men. In the 1970 film about Patton, there is a scene in which the general, having repulsed a German armored attack in Tunisia, stands over the burning wreckage of a panzer formation and says, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." It is a great moment in cinema. It is one of the most quoted lines in any war film ever made. George C. Scott delivers it with such conviction that it has, over more than 50 years, become more real to most people than the actual history. It never happened. Patton never said it. Not at El Getter, not anywhere else. There is no diary entry, no letter, no account by any officer who served with him that places those words in his mouth at any point in the war. The line was written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund North for a film that was openly a dramatization rather than a documentary, and it has the quality that the best invented lines have. It sounds like something the man could have said, given everything we know about him. But what Patton actually wrote and said about Rommel is, in its own way, more interesting than the invention. Because what the real Patton wrote was not triumph. It was something closer to professional respect, complicated by the particular frustration of a man who had spent years preparing for a confrontation that, in its most direct form, never arrived. Patton had studied Rommel. He had read his book, the actual book, the 1937 Infantry Tactics Manual, not as a curiosity, but as a working document. He had annotated his own copy of German tactical doctrine. He had followed the North Africa campaign from its beginning, reading the intelligence assessments and the combat reports with the attention of a man who understood he would eventually face what he was reading about. When he arrived in Tunisia in March of 1943, the central premise of his preparation for that theater was the study he had already done of the man he expected to find there. Rommel was gone by the time he arrived. Patton did not know this immediately. American intelligence did not have confirmation of Rommel's departure until weeks after the fact. The Germans had kept the change quiet, and the signals intercepts that would have confirmed it had not been fully processed and translated in time. When Patton drove the Corps forward in the weeks after El Getter, when he issued orders and made decisions, and pushed his commanders to sustain the tempo, part of his mental model of the campaign was the assumption that the man across the line was Rommel. He was fighting a ghost, and Rommel, convalescing in Germany, watching the Tunisia campaign end from the distance of official briefings and private correspondence, was learning what the army he had broken at Kasserine had become without him there to see it. This is the thing that the film gets wrong, not just in the invented line, but in the structure of the confrontation it imagines. The film depicts two men who find each other across the battlefield, who face each other and settle something between them. The real history depicts two men who passed in the dark, who never directly engaged, and who each spent the rest of their lives knowing, in different ways, what had not happened between them. Rommel's life after North Africa did not give him the distance that recovery from a lost campaign might have provided. He was given command of Army Group B in northern Italy in the summer of 1943, tasked with preparing defenses against the Allied landings that everyone expected, but no one could precisely locate. He was then moved to France, given the same task there, responsible for the Atlantic Wall defenses in the sector that included Normandy. He disagreed with the senior German command about strategy for the coming invasion. He lost those arguments. He was on the road traveling home to see his family on June 6, 1944, the morning the Allied forces landed at Normandy, and was not at his headquarters when the battle began. He spent the weeks that followed fighting a defensive campaign with resources that the command structure above him would not release at the moment they might have mattered. On July 17th, his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft on a road in Normandy. He sustained severe head injuries. He was evacuated to hospital and then sent home to recover. 3 days later, on July 20th, the assassination attempt on Hitler at the Wolf's Lair failed. Rommel's name had been discussed among the conspirators as a potential leader of a post-Hitler government. His exact level of knowledge of and involvement in the plot is a matter historians have debated since the war ended, and the full truth of it may not be recoverable. What is documented is that the Gestapo investigation that followed the failed assassination identified Rommel as someone who had been in contact with the conspirators and had not reported those contacts to the appropriate authorities. On October 14, 1944, two German generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They told him that he had a choice. He could face a trial before the People's Court, which meant a public prosecution for treason, an almost certain death sentence, and the seizure of his family's assets and the revocation of any protections they held. Or he could take a poison tablet they had brought with them, after which his death would be attributed to the injuries from the July aircraft attack. His family would be unharmed, and he would receive a state funeral with full military honors. He took the poison. He was dead within 15 minutes. He was 52 years old. The state funeral was held on October 18th. Hitler sent a wreath. Von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy, praising the fallen field marshal's service to the Reich. The German radio announced that the Desert Fox had died of his wounds. The truth of how he died did not become publicly known until after the war ended. The man who had broken the Americans at Kasserine Pass was killed, in the end, not by the army he had underestimated, but by the system he had served. Patton survived Rommel by 14 months. His campaigns after Tunisia were among the most studied in the history of armored warfare. Sicily in the summer of 1943. The breakout from Normandy in August of 1944. Third Army's race across France that covered more ground in less time than any previous armored campaign in history. The relief of Bastogne in December. The army swinging north in the dead of winter to break the German siege in 72 hours. The crossing of the Rhine and the drive into Germany itself. He also slapped 2 soldiers in hospitals in Sicily, and that nearly ended his career. He was passed over for command of ground forces for the Overlord invasion. He was given Third Army instead of the larger role, and he made Third Army the instrument that ran across France and into Germany at the pace that had been his tactical signature since the days when he had walked the ground at El Getter in his polished boots. He never fought Rommel. By the time Patton was fighting the battles that defined his legacy, Rommel was already dead. On December 9, 1945, 7 months after the war in Europe ended, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when the vehicle was struck in a low-speed collision by a military truck. He sustained a broken neck. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, and was buried at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, among the men of Third Army at his specific request. He was 60 years old. The 2 most famous commanders of the North Africa campaign died within 14 months of each other. One killed by his own government, one in a car accident in the peace that followed the war they had both shaped. Neither of them had been present for the moment that most clearly defined the relationship between them. The morning at El Getter, when the formations Rommel had broken came back against the German armor and held. What the real Rommel said, when his intelligence officer set that report on the desk in the villa at Sfax on the morning of March 7, 1943, is not recorded in any document that has survived. The specific words of that specific moment are gone, if they ever existed in writing at all. What is recorded in the papers that his wife Lucy preserved and that Liddell Hart eventually compiled and published is the assessment that preceded and surrounded that moment. That the American Army had the material foundation and the individual soldier quality to become a formidable force, that its deficiency was one of leadership, and that leadership deficiencies were precisely the kind of deficiency that could be corrected by a single appointment. He left North Africa 3 days after reading that Patton had been given that appointment. He did not leave because Patton had arrived. He left because a strategic situation that had been beyond recovery for months had just lost the last factor, his own presence, that had been masking how far gone it already was. But the timing tells its own story. The Desert Fox, who had spent 2 years understanding every army he faced, who had built his reputation on the speed with which he read a battlefield and acted on what he read, looked at the intelligence report in his hand, put it down, and walked to the airfield. He had made an assessment. He had drawn a conclusion from it. And one of the things that conclusion told him was that the army he had broken in February was no longer the army he had broken in February. He was right. And the soldiers who had survived Kasserine and rebuilt themselves in 10 days under a new commander, the soldiers who held the line at El Getter on the morning of March 23rd while the 10th Panzer came forward and found something different from what it had expected, those soldiers proved him right in the only way that mattered. They proved it without him there to see it. That is the honest ending of this story, not the line from a film, not the invented confrontation between two famous men on the same piece of ground, but the quieter and stranger truth that the most significant thing these two soldiers said to each other was never spoken. It was expressed in what happened on a valley floor in Tunisia on a March morning in 1943, in the gap between what the German armor commander leading his column forward expected to find and what he actually found. In the line of American infantry that did not break. In the artillery that had been pre-sighted on the exact ground the panzers were crossing. In the 18 days of hard work that no one who had not been inside 2nd Corps during those 18 days could see from the outside, but that the 10th Panzer Division discovered at the worst possible time and in the most direct way available. Rommel had said, before he left, that the Americans could become this. He had not said they already were. That distinction cost him nothing personally. The campaign was already lost. But it is the distinction that defines what this story is actually about. Not the confrontation between two famous generals. The confrontation between what an army was and what it became. Between the defeat at Kasserine and the discipline at El Getter. Between the command bunker 40 miles behind the line and the man in the polished boots walking the ground he intended to hold. Rommel read the report. He put down. He understood what it meant. He was not wrong. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.